Alright, so after our last episode, we have our receiver component ready to roll, as you can see there. But we still need to get our seeker component done so we can actually interact with our receiver component. So that's what we're going to do today, and let's get right into it. So we find ourselves in Jira and make that interaction seeker component task and move it into the board, copy down that description, then just throw this under engineering and the interactions epic, and then we can move over to our board, throw this into in progress, and we can get started. Alright, now we're in Unreal, and we need to go fix the collision settings that didn't save. So make sure that you check out that file, because as you can see, none of my stuff from the last episode saved. So now we are going to re-enter it. So we'll create a new object channel, and we're going to set it to ignore, interactable object. And this is the one that we want our trace to use. So just make sure you're doing this correctly. I'll go over it when we get in there, but just make sure you have this set right, because there's an opportunity to make a mistake and you won't see any results from your trace if you set this up wrong. So just make sure you're following along diligently, and we can set that to query only, and we want it to be an interactable object. And fill out that description and set everything to ignore. That's what happens when you click that top one. And then the two custom ones we made, we want to set to overlap. Alright, so we should be all set in here with the collisions. I'm just going to reopen and check them because I have trust issues at this point. And very important here, we're going to open the game engine.ini and search for interactable. And we see down here, we have our interactable object channel. We can find it down here. We want the one that isn't a trace. I've had issues with the trace where it's not working, hence we're using the interactable object. But there's going to come a time where we need to select our channel, and you want the one that says interactable object. So for me, it's channel 1. And it might be different for you, so you're going to have to go into that file and figure out what your channel is. So with that being said, we're going to get into making the actual component. So go into our interactions folder, and I make an actor component here, but you want to make a scene component, not an actor component, a scene component. I end up fixing this later, but might as well just not have the issue for you. Alright, so we'll create our component, and I'll skip ahead until it's done. And now we have to make our HSS version of the component. So we'll go into the interactions folder, create new class, and search for interaction seeker. Yep, that's the one. And we'll update this to HSS, get rid of the my at the beginning, press create class, and I'll skip ahead until it's done. So now we're going to get into the code, and first we need to make some changes in the interaction interface. And what we're going to do here is change these to const references. And what that's going to do is it's going to make our performance way better, because when you have just a standard input like this, it's going to copy it every single time behind the scenes. And if we're just using a const reference, that is the preferred option. I just forgot to do it last time, so we're going to swap these out. No big deal. And then we'll skip ahead to the .cpp and make that exact same change to make sure that we're not copying these input variables. Because I got a little sloppy before, and we're fixing it now. So that's good to see. And now we need to make the same changes in the receiver component. So just make all these as const references. And we'll just go through these real quick. Looking good. And again, this will just make everything a lot more efficient, which is always good. And we're going to head over to the .cpp, and we're going to quickly get rid of this setup attachment line that we did last time. And we're going to add these lines at the bottom, which will set up our component to trigger overlap and hit events, which is very important. So make sure you have those last two lines. And now we're going to start swapping out the variables again, because remember, these functions override the interface ones, so we need to change these as well. So still in the receiver.cpp, we need to completely redo the interactable function. So first we'll check the flag. Then the important thing we missed last time is we need to make sure that the key given matches our list. We weren't doing that last time, so now we are, so that's good. And then once it passes those two checks, we can return true. So then we'll move over to our receive interaction, and we're going to update this as well. So first we're going to check to see if the key is in the array, and then we're going to get if the character is locally controlled. And the reason we need that, as we add the include up here, is because we want to make sure we aren't printing out multiple print messages. And this is admittedly a bit of a band-aid solution for now, but in a couple of episodes, don't worry, we're gonna properly replicate this over the network, so we won't have to put these kind of janky is locally controlled checks in here. And now we move over to the seeker, and what's funny is I fixed the not putting in the right class just by pasting in all the code. As you can see, it says useScene component now. Just a happy accident. But yeah, we'll swap in the description, and this is basically going to be used to seek out interactable actors in the world. And now we'll move down to the Unreal Functions public, and we have our constructor where we're just going to be creating our components and setting the default values. And then we have tick, which is actually going to do something, because we're going to need it to check for interactions. But as you'll see, we're going to be running this at a reduced tick rate to make our performance better, and we're going to toggle it on and off. So speaking of that, we have our seeker functions, and these are still public, and these are going to do exactly what they say in the description. So enable is going to enable tick and start the seeking process, and disable is going to disable tick and the seeking process. So pretty straightforward there. But remember, we need the interaction key as well, because we need to make sure we're able to look for multiple types of interactions. And then we have protected, we have begin play, which doesn't do anything, just calls the parents version. And then we have our helper function, process closest interaction. And we could absolutely do all this logic in tick directly, but I would rather have a helper function here. There's minimal overhead, and it just makes things look a lot cleaner. And then we have at the bottom here our enable and disable debug. So this is just going to turn on debug and turn off debug, just like the functions we had in the receiver. And then we have our arrow component there at the bottom. And this is just going to show us visually what direction the seeker is looking in. And then we have some interaction settings. We have the tick rate, which is 0.1, which is pretty slow, but it'll be good enough. And then we have the interaction distance, the interaction radius, and then our debug mode enabled flag. So that all looks good to me. And now we can move on to the parameters. And what we have here is our array of interaction keys. And then we have an interaction sphere that we're saving off. And that will be used during our trace. If we don't declare it as a variable, we'll have to keep making it over and over again, which again will hurt performance. So that's why we're just kind of saving it off as a variable here. And now we find ourselves in the seeker.cpp, and we'll paste in all our code and go line by line. So see all those includes at the top, just make sure you have those or else you'll get an error. And to start here, we want to say that the component can tick, but we want to start with tick disabled because we want to be manually turning that on. And then we set our tick rate as well in the next line. And then we have the creation of our arrow component. And see, we're setting it hidden by default, making it blue, making it a little bigger. And then those treat as sprite and screen size scaled are just kind of generic things that people typically use for arrow components. And then we have tick, where we call our parent's version. Then we check to make sure we have active keys. And if we don't, just return out, because there's no sense in processing the interactions if we don't have any keys. And then we call our process closest interaction function at the end, which we'll fill out in a bit here. We then have enable and disable. So we're just adding the key, setting the tick rate, and enabling tick and enable. And in disable, we remove the key. We then check to see if we have no keys left and disable tick. And the reason we do this instead of just disabling tick outright is we want this system to be able to handle the case where we have multiple interaction keys that we're seeking. So just because we remove one, there might be other ones that we should still be looking for. And then we'll scroll down to begin play, and we're doing quite a bit in here. So first, we're forcing the arrow component to attach, and then we're creating our collision sphere. And the reason we're making it again here is to make sure that interaction radius is actually being used. And then the last line, we're checking that debug mode enabled flag and turning on debug mode if it is. And as promised, we have our process closest interaction, and there's a lot to unpack here. So first, we need to get all the actors that are colliding with our sphere that we're tracing into the world. So that's what that sweep multi by channel is it basically projects that sphere we made and sweeps it from the start location to the end location. And see right there, we have the trace channel. And I actually have this incorrect in here as trace channel 2. But we'll see if I have an issue with this. I honestly don't remember. And an important step here as well is to add this actor as the ignored actor, just to make sure we're not hitting ourselves. And then the next line, we basically check if debug mode is on. And if so, and another locally controlled check passes, we're going to draw a debug sphere so that we can see visually what we're sending out into the world. So this will help us a lot in debugging. So again, make sure that trace channel is right for you. So you check the .ini, but we'll see what happens here. And then after that, we want to return out if we have no results. Then we need to sort the results by distance to the component. And we just want to do this to make sure they're sorted this way. they should be this way by default, but we're doing this just in case there's an edge case where it doesn't work. And then we now need to loop through the results and find a object that we can interact with. So we're using a range-based for loop to do this. And this little underline here is yelling at me that we should be using a const reference here, because again, I forgot to do it. So we'll make that change. And the first line, we are casting to the component. So as you can see, we're getting the component there. And don't copy down this part, because this was just a leftover debug thing I was doing. And the next line, we want to check if we got a component, and then we can loop over the interaction keys, and we're going to check if the actor is interactable for the key. And if so, we're going to call the receive interaction. And then once we interact with one object, we want to set it to true, that flag that we made there. And also add a comment for the call receive interaction function that I didn't have in the previous frame. And then after that loop, we want to check to see if that performed interaction flag is true. Because if it is true, we don't need to keep looping through this. And that's what that break line does, is it basically breaks out of whatever loop you're in. So it's actually very helpful in cases like this, because once we interact with one object, we don't want to keep interacting with other objects, just the closest one. And then we have our enable and disable debug at the end here. So just enabling, we're just turning on the arrow, and disabling it, we're just turning off the arrow. So pretty simple stuff. And see, now I realized my mistake with the collision channel. So see, we want interactable object. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see. But see, our interactable object is game trace channel 1. So that's what we want to use. And as you can see, I have channel 2 in there, so it wouldn't have worked. We then move on to our HSS version of this and just copy in that description, and we'll update it to hide, seek, survive. But basically standard stuff. We're just implementing this for future expansion, but we're probably not going to use it during hide, seek, survive. All good though. And then we just hop into the CPP and adjust the spacing like so. And then we need to make some adjustments in the character. So first we're going to add in a forward declaration for our seeker comp CCS. Just like that. And then we hop down here to components and actually declare our seeker component, just like that. So pretty straightforward stuff. And now we'll move over to the .cpp. And first we need to add the include for our seeker. So interaction / interaction seeker comp.h. And now we're going to create the component and initialize it. So as you can see, we're attaching it to the camera to make sure we're going to be interacting with what the player is looking at. And then we're in begin play. We need to update this. So first we're going to check to make sure we have an interaction receiver comp. And then we're going to add the interaction key of character. And then to the seeker, we're going to enable it with the key of character. So that should take care of that. And the last little thing we need to do for C++ changes is swap in our seeker HSS in the character HSS.cpp, like we've been doing for all the other components. And we also need to add in that include, so interaction seeker comp HSS. And our squiggly will go away. And then we can build, and I'll skip ahead until it's done, and we're in the engine again. Alright, so back in the editor, we're going to go to our character and enable debug on that component. So to do that, we go to viewport, and we go to our seeker comp, see right there, and enable debug, compile, save, and now we can test. And we want to make sure we're testing as the listen server with 2 players. So we'll select that and press play. And I'll show you guys a popped out view so you can see it better. But as you can see, our seeker component is ejecting that little sphere and interacting with the interaction component of the other character. So we're good to call it a day and speed run the review process here. So we'll package it up. And I'll skip ahead until it's done. And just like that, packaging succeeded. Now we'll move the task into review. We'll test the build. Everything's looking fine. We don't have anything to interact with because the other character isn't there. But this is good enough for me. Quick look at our perforce change set. And we'll send it on its way here. And last but not least, we'll throw this into done, add our little comment. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.